I stepped into the chilly November air, the last words of my husband still echoing in my ears, derisive and dismissive, a jarring reminder of the home I was leaving behind. It had been another typical evening, if one could ever call the mounting hostility typical. Get out, you low-brained, bottom-of-the-barrel woman, earning $7 an hour. Don't act like a mother when you're not. Low income. The venom in John's voice cut deeper than the cold. My name is Catherine. I turned 53 this year. I married John when I was 35, and I've been living with him and his daughter, Elizabeth, ever since. On the surface, we might have appeared like any other family, a father, a stepmother, and a daughter living under one roof. But beneath that facade was a brewing storm of resentment and degradation. John is 49, handsome with a charismatic charm that had initially swept me off my feet at a social mixer. Back then, he was the epitome of a gentleman, kind, attentive, and a doting father to Elizabeth, who was just a young girl. Aware of his past as a divorced man, I had embraced the role of stepmother with open arms, eager to cherish and love both him and his child. But soon after our vows, the facade crumbled. John's respect turned into disdain, particularly about my educational background or the lack thereof, as he pointed out during our countless arguments. He deemed it fitting that I should handle all household chores, reinforcing the traditional roles that belied his seemingly progressive views while we dated. Elizabeth, now 22, mirrored her father's sentiments. From the beginning, she had kept me at an arm's length, never accepting me as a mother figure. Her rebellion during her teenage years only grew into cold indifference as she matured, her treatment of me oscillating between neglect and outright disdain. The oppression wasn't just emotional. It was palpable in every chore I did unaided, in every dinner I cooked only to face criticism, and in every paycheck I earned that was deemed insufficient. When Elizabeth started high school, I returned to the workforce, thinking perhaps financial contribution might soften their harsh view of me. Instead, it gave them new ammunition. My low education and meager income were just further proof of my inadequacy. All these years, I had naively believed that perhaps all families faced such trials after marriage. But a conversation with a close friend opened my eyes. It wasn't normal, it wasn't acceptable. I was living in a toxic environment, belittled and berated for things that should have been my strengths. This realization hit me as I packed the last of my belongings into a battered suitcase. My hands trembled not just from the cold but from the uncertainty and fear of stepping into the unknown. Yet, as I turned my back on the house that had been my prison, I felt a spark of something unfamiliar and a long while hope. John and Elizabeth would probably never understand or accept my worth. They might even regret their treatment of me once they realized who I really was beyond the labels they had assigned me. But as I walked down the street, away from the echoes of their harsh words, I knew it no longer mattered. What mattered was reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my identity. As Catherine, not as someone's low-income, undereducated wife and stepmother. That night, as I lay in bed, the dim light of the street lamps filtering through the curtains, I couldn't help but replay the evening's events over in my mind. The constant belittlement had become a painful norm, but this deliberate exclusion was a stark, heart-rending escalation. It felt as if John and Elizabeth were systematically trying to erase my presence from their lives, as if I were merely a ghost haunting the edges of their existence. Each day blurred into the next, a cycle of toil and disregard. Even after a long day at work, where my part-time job demanded as much from me as any full-time position, I returned home to a second shift. This home life, which consumed even my weekends with endless chores, was exhausting. I had considered divorce many times, but the thought of the upheaval that would follow always held me back. Yet, that evening's blatant disrespect pushed me further toward the brink. The routine had been the same as always. I came home to find John lounging in his chair and Elizabeth scrolling endlessly on her phone. Their casual dismissal of my arrival with snide comments about my lateness and their hunger was the typical greeting I had come to expect. "Aren't you home late?" "I'm hungry." "Quite the life for a part-timer, eh?" "There's no need for overtime," John had remarked dryly, his words dripping with disdain. Apologizing, as I always did, I rushed to the kitchen to whip up something quick, mindful of their impatience and the criticism I would face if the meal seemed too simple or scant. Despite my haste, I managed to prepare 5 different dishes within 30 minutes, a feat that usually brought me a small sense of accomplishment, but not tonight. "Sorry for the delay, dinner's ready," I announced, setting the table with trembling hands, my nerves frayed from the rush and the sharp edges of their earlier words. But they didn't move to eat. They didn't even look at the dishes. The food sat steaming between us, an ignored testament to my efforts. As I questioned their odd behavior, wondering aloud why they weren't eating despite their earlier complaints of hunger, the intercom's ring sliced through the tense air. It was late, past 7 p.m., and unexpected. My confusion must have been evident as I stood perplexed, but John brushed past me to answer the door. He returned a moment later, a plastic bag in hand, triumphantly announcing the arrival of the pizza they had ordered without telling me. "Look, it finally arrived. Let's eat, yay! It's been so long since we had pizza. Let's eat." "I'm so hungry my stomach could stick to my back," Elizabeth exclaimed, her delight a sharp contrast to the cold dismissal I had just experienced. They devoured the pizza with glee, ignoring the dinner I had prepared. I stood there, the realization dawning on me that this had been their plan all along. They had known the pizza was coming, yet had let me cook, a cruel game designed to underscore my irrelevance. That night, I didn't argue. I didn't express my hurt. I simply wrapped my own uneaten plate in cling film, stored it in the fridge, and retreated to my room. The smell of pizza lingered, a taunting aroma that I couldn't bear. Alone in my darkened room, the sound of their laughter and the scent of their meal mingling in the air, I lay awake, the pain and humiliation gnawing at me. This wasn't just another argument or a misunderstanding, this was a clear message. They didn't see me. They didn't want me. The bed felt colder that night, the sheets rough against my skin as if even they were rejecting me. I turned over, my thoughts racing a whirlwind of hurt and indignation. How much longer could I endure this? I would have made the necessary preparations. As it was, the room only had a cursory cleaning, and there was nothing in the fridge that could quickly be turned into a respectable meal. My husband's accusation, "See, I told you the room is a mess and she doesn't cook for us," stung sharply, especially in front of his colleagues. His words were a calculated blow, meant to undermine and embarrass me. "If you're bringing someone over, you could have told me in advance," I retorted, the frustration clear in my voice. "I did tell you. It's your fault for forgetting," he snapped back, his voice raised just enough to carry over the laughter and chatter of his guests in the living room. He then proceeded to drink with his friends, jovially complaining about my lack of domestic prowess, further soiling my reputation as they ordered takeout to cover for the meal I hadn't prepared. Feeling utterly defeated and marginalized in my own home, I retreated to the confines of my bedroom, shutting the door to muffle the sounds of their enjoyment. The echo of their laughter and the smell of takeout food filled the house, a constant reminder of my perceived inadequacy. The isolation in my bedroom became a nightly ritual. Lying there, I couldn't help but reflect on the futility of my efforts to mend our family ties. The stark contrast between my dreams for our family and the harsh reality was overwhelming. I had wanted to foster a warm, loving environment, but it seemed that I was the only one interested in achieving that goal. Each attempt was met with indifference or outright hostility, making me feel more like an unwanted intruder than a family member. My relationship with Elizabeth was equally strained. Despite my attempts to connect and guide her as a mother figure, she only pushed back harder. Her recent comments about my educational background mirrored her father's disdain, emphasizing the educational gap between us. "You're just a high school graduate, right? It's unbelievable, considering both Dad and I graduated from prestigious universities." Her words were sharp, designed to hurt, and they did. Elizabeth's disinterest in understanding or valuing my life experience beyond academic credentials was disheartening. After all these years, she still didn't call me Mom, and her actions made it clear she likely never would. The distance between us grew as the house fell into a silent routine. I stopped cooking meals, seeing no point in preparing food that wouldn't be eaten or appreciated. My only solace was my job, where I earned more than the meager wage they accused me of accepting. Yet, even this was a point of contention and ridicule. That evening, as I sat alone in my room, the sound of mirth and merriment below felt like a world away. I realized that no matter how hard I worked or how much I tried to prove myself, it would never be enough. They had formed their opinions of me long ago, and nothing seemed capable of changing their minds. The realization was a painful one, but it brought a certain clarity. Perhaps it was time to reconsider my place in this house and in their lives. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to find a place where I was valued and seen, not for my academic credentials or cooking skills, but for who I was. They called out mockingly, "Oh, are you crying now? We knew you couldn't handle this." The cruel delight in their voices was unmistakable. I wiped the tears hastily with the back of my hand, angry at myself for giving them this satisfaction, but more so, I was frustrated by the painful realization that my efforts and desires for family unity were so thoroughly unappreciated. I was tired, exhausted from the emotional turmoil and the relentless belittling. As I continued to pack, the reality of my decision to leave sank in. I had long felt invisible in this house, a ghost whose efforts were overlooked and whose presence was barely tolerated. I realized that leaving might actually be a relief, a chance to start anew where I wasn't constantly demeaned. I came across various keepsakes from the early days of our marriage, photos where we all smiled, a time when hope for a happy family life still seemed possible. Touching these memories, a wave of sadness washed over me, not for the present but for the lost potential of what could have been. "I'm not going to beg on my knees," I responded firmly, my voice steady despite the tremors I felt inside. "I deserve respect and happiness, neither of which I've found here. You say I bring shame upon you, but the only shame I feel is for having allowed myself to be treated this way for so long." I could hear them following me, their taunts growing louder as they tried to shake my resolve. "Pretending to be strong, huh? You'll come crawling back when you realize how hard it is out there without us." But their words, meant to intimidate, only strengthened my resolve. For years, I had clung to the hope that things might change, that they would see my worth and treat me as an equal member of the family. But that hope had been a chain, not a lifeline. Breaking free was terrifying, but necessary. I finished packing, my bags a tangible sign of my decision. As I zipped them closed, I felt a certain lightness, a relief mingled with a profound sadness. Walking out of the room, I faced them both. Their expressions had shifted slightly, perhaps they realized that their words could no longer control me. "I've done my best to be part of this family, but it's clear that you've never seen me as such. I'm leaving, and this time, it's for good." Their smirks faltered, replaced briefly by what looked like confusion, perhaps even fear. It seemed they had never truly considered the possibility that I would leave, that their scapegoat could walk away. For a moment, they were silent, perhaps finally grasping the reality and the consequences of their actions. As I stepped out of the house, the door closing behind me felt like a barrier going up between my past and my future. I was stepping into the unknown, but for the first time in a long while, I felt a spark of hope for peace, for respect, and for a new beginning where I was valued. My heart was heavy, but my spirit was unburdened. As I held the phone away from my ear, listening to John's shouts distorted by the distance, a part of me felt detached, as if I were observing someone else's drama unfold. His refusal to accept the divorce was absurd yet predictable, reflecting his desire to control the narrative and maintain appearances, even when they no longer served any functional purpose. "You're the ones who kicked me out, right?" I repeated firmly, my voice steadier than I felt. "It only makes sense to divorce if I'm leaving. This isn't a joke, John." His response was a mix of anger and disbelief. "I will never allow a divorce," he asserted, as if his permission was the linchpin holding our failed marriage together. This reaction only confirmed my decision. It was clear that he had never expected me to take such definitive action. In his mind, his earlier command for me to leave had likely been just another form of manipulation, another attempt to assert his dominance by showing me that my place could always be questioned, that my presence was contingent on his tolerance. It dawned on me then that he had probably never contemplated the possibility of me actually walking away for good. After hanging up, I sat quietly in my parents' living room, the comforting familiarity of the space enveloping me like a soft blanket. My parents, Hillary and Ken, had been nothing but supportive since I arrived, their concern a stark contrast to the cold dismissal I had grown accustomed to at my own home. Their simple acts of kindness, the warm tea, the quiet space to rest, reminded me of what a healthy family environment felt like, something I hadn't experienced in years. Taking a day off from work had been a necessary respite, giving me the space to breathe and regroup. The encouraging emails from my colleagues were little beacons of support, illuminating the stark difference between my work environment and what I had endured at home. Each message reinforced the realization that my value and self-worth extended far beyond the confines of my marriage. This newfound perspective was liberating. It allowed me to see the possibilities of a life unencumbered by John and Elizabeth's demeaning attitudes. I could rebuild, find solace in my work, and surround myself with people who respected and appreciated me. The decision to fill out the divorce form had been both terrifying and exhilarating. Sending it had been a declaration of my newfound independence. John's call, while unsettling, had not shaken my resolve. It had only solidified my understanding that his attempts to control me were based on his expectations that I would always capitulate. Over the next few days, I allowed myself to do little, to think less, and to simply be. It was a healing time, a period to redefine who I was outside of the oppressive shadows of my marriage. The idea of being forcibly linked to John and Elizabeth was unbearable, and I was determined to sever those ties permanently. As I contemplated my next steps, I realized that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. Yet, each step away from my past was a step toward a future where I could stand tall, not just because my parents told me to, but because I truly felt it within myself. The road to recovery and reclaiming my life was just beginning, and for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to walk it. I didn't step inside, he seemed perplexed. "Aren't you coming in?" he asked, his voice tinged with a mix of condescension and genuine confusion. "No, I'm not here to stay. I'm here to talk about the divorce and finalize our arrangements," I stated clearly, standing my ground at the threshold. His expression shifted from smug satisfaction to annoyance. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" he muttered, almost to himself, as if the reality of the situation was just beginning to sink in. "Yes, I am," I affirmed, feeling my confidence grow as I spoke. "It's better for all of us. You know this isn't working. We're unhappy, and it's unhealthy. It's time to move on." As I entered the house, the familiar sights and smells brought a rush of memories, each corner a reminder of years spent in a thankless role. The living room where I had spent countless evenings trying to make peace, the dining area where my cooking had been either ignored or criticized. Each step was a reinforcement of why I had left. John followed me into the kitchen, where we could talk without the prying ears of Elizabeth, who I assumed was in her room. I could feel his eyes on me, measuring, trying to decipher my motives. "Look, I understand why you want to leave, but think about Elizabeth. This will hurt her too," he tried, playing on my sympathies, a tactic that might have worked in the past. "Elizabeth will understand, eventually. She's young, and she will adapt. Staying in an unhappy marriage isn't healthy for any of us, and continuing to pretend would be worse for her in the long run," I explained calmly. John sighed, running his hands through his hair. "And the house? And the inheritance?" he probed, his true concern surfacing. "The house can be sold. We can split the proceeds. As for the inheritance, that is my family's business, and it has nothing to do with you or this marriage," I countered firmly, knowing that he was partly in this for the financial security he thought I would bring him in the future. He looked at me, a mix of frustration and realization crossing his face. "I never thought you'd actually go through with this," he admitted, the fight draining out of him. "I know," I said, a small part of me feeling sorry for him, for the man I had once loved, who had lost his way so thoroughly in his own greed and insecurity. We discussed logistics, the division of assets, and other practical matters. It was a strange conversation, marked by a business-like formality that belied the years of tumultuous marriage. When it was over, I felt a sense of closure, as if finally, I was turning over the last page of a particularly difficult chapter of my life. As I left the house for what I knew would be the last time, I didn't look back. The weight of the past was behind me now, and ahead lay a path that I would carve with my own hands, free from the shadows of disparagement and manipulation. Stepping out into the light of a new day, I felt not just the possibility, but the certainty of a fresh start. "I want you both to understand that this is final," I stated firmly as I slid the document across the table to John. His eyes briefly skimmed the paper, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. Beside him, Elizabeth, whose interest seemed solely piqued by the mention of money, nodded, her earlier annoyance replaced by a calculated coldness. "Yes, the $100,000 is really yours," I confirmed. John hesitantly took the pen I offered, signing the divorce papers with a stroke that seemed to carry the weight of our entire failed relationship. As he did so, I felt a profound sense of release. The last link that tethered me to a life of discontent and disrespect was finally severed. "You're really serious about letting go of everything, just like that?" John asked, his voice tinged with a mix of suspicion and surprise. "Yes, I am," I replied, my tone unwavering. "My peace of mind and freedom are worth far more than any amount of money or material possession. I hope you both find what you're looking for with this." Elizabeth, who had been mostly silent, finally spoke up, her voice sharp and acquisitive. "So, the money is really ours now? Just like that?" "Yes, it is," I said, handing over another paper, the formal renunciation of my claim to any of the joint assets. They took it, barely looking at me, their minds already racing ahead to their newfound financial gain. As they began to discuss their plans for the money, almost joyously, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony of the situation. Here I was, giving up everything I had legally owned in our joint life together, and yet I felt richer than ever. Freed from a marriage that had brought me nothing but pain and belittlement, I was now free to rebuild a life on my own terms without resentment, without scorn, and without the oppressive weight of trying to please those who never truly valued me. I watched them for a moment longer, their laughter shallow and their delight short-lived, as they did not realize that the wealth they so coveted could never buy the happiness or respect they lacked. Then, standing up, I felt lighter than I had in years. With a polite nod, I excused myself, leaving them to their superficial victories. Walking out of the cafe, the cool air brushed against my face, and a gentle sun broke through the clouds. I felt an overwhelming sense of possibility and renewal. For the first time in a long while, the future seemed not only hopeful, but bright. I was finally free, not just from a toxic marriage, but from the burden of living a life that was not my own. Now, I could start anew, on my own terms, with a clear heart and a strong sense of self. Holding firm, despite the tumultuous scene unfolding before me. My father's presence had changed the dynamic dramatically. His protection gave me a further sense of security as I faced down my soon-to-be ex-husband and his daughter. "You promised to cherish my daughter, yet you married her for her inheritance," my father continued, his voice filled with a mix of anger and disappointment. John's face paled under his gaze, his usual bravado dissolving into silence. Elizabeth, caught between her father and my imposing parent, seemed unsure of herself for the first time. "I didn't do anything," she protested weakly, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Be quiet, Elizabeth. This isn't about what you did or didn't do directly. It's about what you supported, what you allowed, and how you benefited from treating Catherine poorly," my father corrected sternly. John tried to interject, to salvage some shred of dignity. "It was a misunderstanding, Ken. We were just dash." "A misunderstanding?" My father cut him off, his tone incredulous. "I heard everything. There's no misunderstanding your intentions or your actions." The weight of their betrayal, their greed, and their disrespect had been heavy. Now, it was being lifted publicly and definitively. John's gaze darted around, looking for any sort of ally or escape, but he found none. "And about the inheritance," I interjected, turning back to the matter at hand. "Yes, I am now the president of the company my father built, and yes, I will inherit everything related to it." That's not just money, it's responsibility, something you never truly understood or respected. My father nodded in approval, his earlier anger shifting to a look of pride as he regarded me. I continued, feeling empowered and vindicated. This company will remain in the family, as intended. And as for our marriage, it's over. You signed the divorce papers, and those will be processed as stated. John's desperation became palpable. But the $100,000 That's yours as we agreed, I said, cutting him off before he could argue further. Consider it a parting gift, and far more generosity than you've shown me. As the reality set in for John and Elizabeth, their expressions turned from disbelief to realization. The tables had turned entirely. They were losing not just a wife and stepmother, but a substantial financial opportunity they hadn't even known existed until too late. With nothing more to be said, I stood up, ready to leave the emotional wreckage behind. I wish you both well, I said, not unkindly, but with a finality that marked the end of our shared chapter. My father and I walked out of the cafe together, the early evening air cool and refreshing. It felt like a new beginning, not just for my professional life, but personally as well. As we headed to his car, my father put an arm around my shoulders, a gesture of support and solidarity. You handled that better than anyone could have expected, he said, squeezing my shoulder gently. Thanks, Dad. I think it's time to focus on the future now, don't you? Absolutely, he agreed, a smile breaking through the seriousness of the last hour. As we drove away, leaving John and Elizabeth to their own devices, I felt not just the closure of a painful chapter but the promising start of something new, something entirely my own making. Continuing the conversation in my office, I faced Elizabeth and my ex-husband with a calm but firm demeanor. Elizabeth's frustration was palpable, and my ex-husband's support of her position, despite the evidence presented, was predictable. Dad, this isn't just about a job. It's about integrity and the reputation of our company, I explained, trying to make him understand the broader implications of hiring someone who openly disrespected the organization on public platforms. But she's your stepdaughter. Can't you just give her another chance? My ex-husband pleaded, his voice tinged with desperation. Being related does not give Elizabeth the right to a position in the company, especially not when her actions could jeopardize our reputation. We must hold everyone to the same standards, regardless of personal connections, I responded. It was crucial for me to maintain professional integrity, even if it meant making tough decisions like this. Elizabeth, still unable to grasp the severity of her actions, interjected, "It's just some posts online. Everyone vents on social media. You're taking this too seriously." I understand that people vent online, but when those vents are about the very company you wish to work for, it becomes a matter of professional conduct, I said. In any job, especially in positions where you represent a company, how you express yourself online matters. This is a basic expectation of any employee in our company, and unfortunately, your posts do not align with our values. The realization that there would be no reversal of the decision seemed to finally settle in for Elizabeth and my ex-husband. His next concern, however, quickly turned to financial matters. "We'll still demand what's ours in terms of property," he stated, reverting to his default position of seeking financial gain. Regarding the property and any financial arrangements, those were clearly settled in the divorce agreement which you signed, I reminded him firmly. Everything was legally divided according to that agreement. There is no further claim to pursue. My father, who had been silently observing the exchange, finally spoke up, his voice steady and authoritative. "You need to accept the situation and move on. Catherine has been more than fair in her dealings with both of you. Continuing to pursue this is not only unproductive, but also damaging to everyone involved." As they digested his words, I added, "I wish things could have ended differently, but professional and personal boundaries must be respected. I hope, in time, you both find what you're looking for and can appreciate the reasons behind the decisions made here today." Their departure from my office marked not just the end of our discussion, but also symbolized the final closure on a chapter of my life that had been filled with turmoil and emotional manipulation. As they left, I felt a weight lift. I had not only managed to preserve my dignity and the integrity of my family's company, but I had also stood up for my own values and future. Returning to my work, I felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The challenges of the past had fortified my resolve, and looking forward, I was ready to lead with confidence and a clear conscience, knowing that the choices I made were for the best interests of both my personal life and my professional responsibilities. With my ex-husband and Elizabeth increasingly desperate, their situation became the talk of our mutual acquaintances. It was clear that Elizabeth's social media missteps had not only cost her the job at my company, but had also led to a wider fallout among her social circle. This seemed to amplify her existing difficulties, pushing her into a more isolated position, both professionally and personally. I learned from a mutual friend that the repercussions were severe. Elizabeth, once so confident and supported by her network of friends, found herself ostracized. Her friends, upon seeing the public display of her attitudes and the subsequent consequences, began distancing themselves. They were likely reconsidering their association with someone who had publicly shown such a lack of judgment and professionalism. As for my ex-husband, the situation at home had deteriorated significantly. The house, which had never been his domain in terms of upkeep and care, was falling into disarray. Without me to manage the daily chores, and without Elizabeth willing or able to take over, he was overwhelmed by the reality of his new life. His calls became more frequent, each one more pleading than the last. "Please come back home, the house is a mess, Elizabeth doesn't cook either," he would say, his voice filled with a mix of regret and desperation. Each call ended the same way, with my firm reminder that we were divorced and that his current struggles were not my responsibility. "Don't say that, we loved each other once," he would argue, trying to evoke a sense of nostalgia for better times. But those days were overshadowed by years of neglect and disrespect. Maybe I would have reconsidered, I thought fleetingly during one such call, if there had been genuine support or appreciation for me throughout our marriage. But there hadn't been, and the decision to leave was not made lightly. After the last call, I decided it was best to block his number entirely. The finality of that act felt like closing a door firmly on a chapter of my life that needed to end. It was a necessary step to prevent any further emotional manipulation and to protect my newfound peace. Months passed, and life moved forward. My role as president of the company demanded much of my attention, and I was determined to lead with integrity and vision, a stark contrast to the chaotic and undervalued existence I had left behind. My professional achievements started to pile up, bringing a sense of accomplishment and validation that I had made the right choices. Through occasional updates from mutual friends, I heard about Elizabeth's continued struggle to find employment. Her tarnished reputation had followed her, making it difficult to secure another position. While I took no pleasure in her hardships, it reinforced the importance of personal responsibility and the consequences of one's actions, lessons she had failed to heed while under my roof. Reflecting on these developments, I felt reaffirmed in my independence and my decisions. The journey had not been without its pains, but the outcome, a life of self-respect and success, was worth every difficult step. As I looked to the future, I did so with the confidence of someone who had navigated through stormy seas to reach calmer waters, ready to face new challenges with a strong sense of self and purpose. The solitary nature of my new life in the city brings with it both freedom and introspection. Each day I discover small joys that I had previously overlooked, like the quiet satisfaction of a home kept just the way I prefer, or the simple pleasure of choosing my meals without considering anyone else's preferences. While my work as the president of a successful company consumes much of my time and energy, it is a fulfilling endeavor. The responsibility of managing a $50 million turnover company not only challenges me but also reinforces my confidence in my capabilities and decision-making skills. Every contract we secure and every project we complete adds to a growing sense of accomplishment that was absent in my previous domestic life. Living alone has also reignited my love for finer things, such as indulging in expensive wine and cheese every Friday night. These evenings have become a cherished ritual, one that marks the end of the workweek and provides a moment to unwind and reflect. However, amidst this there is a part of me that yearns for companionship. Not necessarily romantic, but a connection that transcends the superficial interactions that often fill our days. It's a desire for someone to share in the simple pleasures of life, someone who understands the value of quiet moments and sincere conversation. The woman in my neighborhood, who started conversations with me out of the blue, is becoming a significant part of this new chapter. The exchange of small gifts and casual meetups for tea might seem minor, but they weave a fabric of friendship that enriches my daily life more than I could have anticipated. When she gave me a tulip, it was more than just a flower, it was a gesture of kindness that spoke to a potential deeper bond. I'd begun to look forward to our brief encounters and the effortless chat that accompanies them. Whether this can grow into the kind of connection I long for remains to be seen, but I am open to the possibility. There's an ease between us that suggests the beginnings of true friendship, or perhaps something more profound over time. As I place the tulip in a vase and settle down with my sandwich, I consider reaching out more, initiating conversations not just with her but with other potential friends in my community. Building relationships is a deliberate act, one that requires effort and a willingness to be vulnerable. It's a risk, but one worth taking to possibly find those truly essential individuals in my life. The quiet of my apartment, punctuated by the soft clinking of dishes and the distant hum of city life, is a reminder of how far I've come and how much further I still wish to go. Each day offers a new opportunity to build, to connect, and to enjoy the life I've fought hard to create. And as I sip my tea, looking out over the city, I feel a profound gratitude for every step of the journey that brought me here.